More protests in Hong Kong, despite the government suspending the controversial extradition bill that sparked the anger. So what's fueling the demonstrations now? And what will it take to end what's been dubbed the summer of discontent? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Hala Mohiuddin. Weeks of protests in Hong Kong show no sign of ending. The parliament in the semi-autonomous Chinese territory has been vandalised. Towns near the border with China have seen unprecedented rallies, and police and protesters have faced off in violent confrontations. Well, it all started with an extradition bill that would have allowed people in Hong Kong to be sent to mainland China for trial. The government has since suspended that bill, the chief executive even describing it as dead. But now the protests have evolved into wider frustration at what is seen as growing political interference from Beijing. Jamila Alindogan has more.
Tens of thousands of protesters have showed up here today. It is unprecedented for a suburban place like Shatton that hasn't seen anything like this in decades. Unexpected even for the organizers. A lot of the protesters here are shouting. They're asking for the police to open up the roads and to allow people to move freely, to speak up. The message against Carrie Lam's government also is quite clear, and to a greater extent, Beijing.
I'm a Hong Kong people, I grew up here, and this is my home, and I try to protect our home, our freedom, our value, yeah.
It remains to be seen what sort of concessions will Carrie Lam's government be able to offer that will be acceptable to the millions of young people who have been taking to the streets. This has gone beyond just the extradition bill. We're seeing all the other issues, as what protesters here have been telling us, this bottled up discontent that has been simmering here in Hong Kong for decades. They tell us the rule of law and the way of life here in Hong Kong is threatened. They want better regulation and they want better protection. Young people who have come here have been accused of rioting. It may seem like that at the onset if you look at the streets, but the protest is so different from the 2014 umbrella movement. Here, this movement is largely leaderless, it has been decentralized, and it has been brought to so many suburban areas like Shatton. It has been localized as well. Even the issues that have come forward now has become all about the protection of basic fundamental freedoms of people. What they want, they say, is accountability, transparency, and justice.
Well, let's bring in today's panel. In Hong Kong, we have Emily Lau. She's a former councillor at the Hong Kong Legislative Council and a former chairwoman of the Democratic Party. In London, we're joined by James Palmer, a senior editor at Foreign Policy magazine, who lived in Beijing from 2004 to 2018. And in Hong Kong, via Skype, Lawrence Ma, the chairman of the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation and a member of the Silent Majority for Hong Kong political party. Welcome to you all. If I could come to you first, Emily Lau. Assurances have been given that this extradition bill, which sparked the protests, is dead. So why, in your view, are these protests continuing?
Well, I think the Chief Executive, Carrie Lam, has not really responded to demands of the protesters and the demands of many Hong Kong people. And that is to say that the bill has been withdrawn, which is the correct terminology, not that the bill is dead. I mean, people don't know what that means. And people are afraid that maybe the bill will suddenly rise up from the dead again. And also, of course, the people would like to see an independent inquiry set up, chaired by a judge, to look into the police brutality and all the chaos in the last few weeks. And she has not responded to these demands,
So,
which
Emily
I think
Lau,
are very reasonable. And that's why the people are very unhappy.
Quite,
Yes.
but were Carrie Lam to turn round and say, we will withdraw this bill, we will formally withdraw this bill and you can have the inquiry, do you think the protests would stop then?
I think emotion will subside quite a bit. Of course, maybe not 100%, but I think that because these are the demands that have been articulated for so long, and if she would come out and say, yes, I will do these things, I think we will see a lot less protests.
Lawrence Ma, what do you say to that? The simple way to end these protests once and for all is for Carrie Lam to change her vocabulary and withdraw the bill rather than kill it, and then to give...
I don't think that would do anything good in cooling down in stopping the protests. I would say it might cool down a bit, but the whole you know that this is not just about the bill. I mean, protesters, and there has been protests in Hong Kong today about parallel importers. So the reason has been move away from the extradition bill. It has moved to other social issues which people do not feel happy about. So and also the stepping down of the chief executive is not the matter, because whoever stands in her position to be the chief executive will have the same social problem as on hand as an issue to tackle with, and the same foreign environment in Hong Kong to tackle with possible foreign influences.
So what are the social issues, Lawrence Ma, that you think are at the heart of this?
Well, I think for so many years, anti-China sentiment has been cooked up, has been inculcated into the mind of the people. So there's a very subtle anti-China, anti-Chinese, anti-national identity sentiment in the public. So whenever we talk about China, whenever we talk about Chinese stuff, people are not happy about them.
And who's cooking up this anti-Chinese sentiment?
Well, by and large, there's a very popular newspaper in Hong Kong, and which has been constantly highlighting the negative aspect of Chinese society, China, and everything about China, and hide away and downscale any good things that the Chinese have. So Hong Kong people have been, for over many years, injected with or inculcated with or implanted with very many negative ideas about Chinese China.
Let me put this to James Palmer now. James Palmer, these protests began after the controversy surrounding the so-called extradition bill. We hear from one side that if this extradition bill was formally withdrawn, that may stop the protests. On the other hand, we're hearing this is down to social issues and anti-China sentiments being fomented by the press. What's your reading of this? Why do you think these protests are continuing?
Well, I would say while the extradition bill was the immediate cause, the bigger problem is a much wider divide in identity between Hong Kongers and the People's Republic as a whole, the mainland. Young Hong Kongers do not feel themselves to be Chinese. Only 3.5% of young Hong Kongers, when interviewed, say that they're Chinese. The vast majority say that they are global citizens, or even more say they're Hong Kongers. And those numbers have dropped sharply in the last 10 years. But where, of course, I'd really disagree with Lawrence is that this isn't the result of inculcation or some kind of propaganda. It's the result of actions by China, by Beijing. It's the result of things like the kidnapping of Hong Kong booksellers, the political paranoia on the mainland, the sense, particularly over the last 5 years, that the mainland has been rapidly deliberalizing. And so from Hong Kongers' point of view, while they once could have believed that the mainland would move more towards where Hong Kong is in terms of freedom of speech, rule of law, and so on, now they're seeing the mainland go backwards and attempt to force that backwardness on Hong Kong.
Lawrence, I'll give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, I disagree with that, because China containment policy, as we all well know, the U.S. is wanting to contain the development of China, and Hong Kong is so free a city that there could be political influences, financial influences, and there is in our part of the world the Color Revolution, which Hong Kong is being used as a tool to subvert the Chinese governance. Now, where we have Hong Kong independence since a couple of years ago, and it is quite apparent that Hong Kong is getting out of hand politically. So, I mean, you cannot blame the Chinese government for tightening control over Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is, if not controlled properly, it would go on an independent city.
Let me put these points to you, Emily Lau, that this is an identity issue rather than the extradition bill per se. Do you think that younger Hong Kongers are feeling less Chinese, and this is a wider pushback against a perceived oppressor?
Well, I think it is an identity issue, yes, but the fear of being sent for trial in mainland China is real, whether it is the youngsters or their families or other political dissidents who could be the target of this bill is a concern of many people, including the young. And of course, the young people are also very, very much put off by President Xi Jinping's absolutely no respect for rule of law, for human rights. And look at the situation in Xinjiang, over 1 million people, Uyghurs, being locked up like that. And also look at the human rights lawyers, the human rights defenders in China. And many of them suffer a lot. And so when the young people here, young and old, when they see the appalling situation in China, of course they feel very, very disturbed. And the young people, of course, they don't want to be part of that country. And they ask me, because they ask me to see if I can help, especially those who hold British national overseas passports. Of course, these people are not that young, but they ask me whether I can ask Britain to help, because they are British citizens.
Lawrence Ma, let me put that to you. Youngsters in Hong Kong are seeing very real concerns given some of the actions in China, notably the detention of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Would you not say those are legitimate concerns that they could push back against?
No, I don't think the Hong Kong youngsters has the mind to care about what happened in Xinjiang. I think what they care about is more about themselves. Of course, it is a concern of the extradition bill, but it shouldn't be a concern to them, because that bill is really for someone who commit a crime in the mainland.
But a lot of that is down to interpretation.
Hong Kong, and then be extradited back to the mainland China. Many of these people do not go to the mainland China even to travel, to visit. They hate China.
But
so they don't go there to commit a crime. So it's impossible for them to be extradited back to the mainland China. So the bill is totally irrelevant to them.
But to play devil's advocate, Lawrence Ma, they would say that this could be used as a pretext for the Chinese authorities to arrest someone and say, you have committed an offence in China, and will we use this as a pretext to take you to the mainland?
No, but they don't even go to the mainland China. They don't even want to go over the border. So that's not a case for them. There might be some concern of the business sectors who do business in China, for Chinese Hong Kong businessmen who do business in China, and may have that concern, but not those protesters on the street, you know, charging riots against the police. Not those people. They shouldn't have concern at all.
So there's provisions in this law? So there are provisions in this law which would exempt people who would not normally go to mainland China? Is that your argument, Lawrence Ma?
No. The principle of law is you have to commit a crime in the mainland China and absconded from that place to be able to have this bill applicable to them, to have them extradited back to China for trial. That's the whole purpose of the bill and the law. I mean, if you haven't been to China, you don't go there, there's no crime committed there, you cannot be extradited back there.
I don't want to stay on the extradition law for too long, but James Palmer, if I could come to you. Surely this extradition bill in itself is a demonstration of upholding the principles of the one country, two systems? Because surely if it were one country, one system, you wouldn't need a separate law to cover these offences. And an additional point to you, James Palmer, why, if China wanted to bring people to justice on the mainland, they don't need a law. As we've seen in the case of the Causeway Bay booksellers, they'll just find a way of making you face justice on the mainland anyway. Is this just a Trojan horse, this debate?
Well, in fact, I mean, there are theories that one of the reasons Carrie Lam introduced this bill was in order to try and sort of formalize the process that was already happening of China kidnapping Hong Kongers from seizing people anyway, and to give it a sort of legal framework. But from the point of view of the protesters, there should be no intrusion at all, and they're worried, I think rightly, because we've seen China try to apply its law extraterritoriality abroad so much over the last few years. We've seen, for instance, last year, China threatened airlines that didn't use the term Taipei, China, it threatened businesses that identified Taiwan as a separate area or country. We've seen the kidnappings. We've seen people at conferences try to tear things out of conference material. So there's a feeling that this is just a sort of stalking horse for that sense of intrusion into Hong Kong's, once sort of inviolable independence, and coupled with things like the railway terminals where mainland law will be applied, that feeling of sort of Hong Kong's sort of autonomy being sliced away bit by bit is really powerful.
I'd like to put this question to all three of you. This is something which has interested me for a while. Why are we seeing these sorts of protests in Hong Kong, but we aren't seeing them in in Macau, for example? Macau is, of course, another territory ruled by the one country, two systems. They have a separate system, but we aren't seeing the mass demonstrations that we have seen on the streets of Hong Kong. Emily Lau.
Well, Macau people do not enjoy too many freedoms, my dear friend. They don't have freedom of the press, and Macau is very small, and it's very much controlled by the communists for many decades. So, but if we're not lucky, Hong Kong could be like Macau within weeks, and that's something we try to prevent.
Is that something, Lawrence Ma, what would you say to this? Why are we not seeing the protests in Macau?
I think Hong Kong has its particular tradition because it has the English legal system. It has a lot of foreigners here. It has a very free press. It has always been, the British has given a tightened control and has a lot of roots in here. So, and the value system of Hong Kong people are pretty international and to a certain extent British. So I would have thought that they would want to mirror the very Western system of democracy and how people can protest, like in other countries. But that's what they wanted in Hong Kong. So I mean, that's what and there's also substantial foreign influences in this place. So that's why it has been Hong Kong has been larger, of course. There are more population. They have, I think, 7 million plus people in Hong Kong, whereas in Macau is only 500,000. So population is larger. So it has more, if it is, as conspiracy says, if it's used as a place to destabilize China, Hong Kong has the power and force to achieve that objective.
James Palmer, is this an assessment you would agree with, that that Hong Kong is better placed to destabilize China than Macau?
I think the explanation for why Macau doesn't protest is quite simple. In 66 and 67, when the communists from the mainland pushed huge protests in both Hong Kong and Macau, the Portuguese authorities effectively caved and gave the Communist Party a powerful role in control of Macau many decades before formally handing it back over. So the Communist Party has been ensconced in Macau for much longer. Its control is much deeper. The threats and the coercion it can apply to people in Macau is much greater. So like the mainland, why do people not protest in the mainland? Because they're terrified. It's not quite the same in Macau, but there's no tradition of resistance, there's no independent press, there's a long kind of established history of control.
And what about the economic factors? How important are economic factors in the unrest that we're seeing? Because Hong Kong is rather notorious for extremely high rents, for low home ownership. Does this play any factor at all, would you say, James Palmer?
I think it plays some factor, but not as much as some apologists for the mainland would argue. We've seen them saying, oh, this is all really about housing prices or really about this. It's not. People are, young people are upset because of housing prices. They're angry, they feel cut off, but that plays into the sense of break with the older generation, the sense that the older generation sold them out to Beijing. You can't separate out these issues. The fact that Hong Kong is effectively controlled by a few powerful families who have thrown their lot in nowadays with the Chinese Communist Party and who also exert sort of monopoly control over Hong Kong businesses, is very recognized by young people, but they see that anger as part of the shared anger against the mainland, against Beijing as well.
Well, we're coming to the end of our discussion. With the few minutes that remain, I'd like to get an assessment from all three of you on where you think this is going to end. What are the next steps for the protests and what lies ahead? If I could come to you first, Emily Lau, how do you see this ending?
Well, I certainly think Carrie Lam should come out and engage the public. She cannot just keep hiding in Government House. And of course, she should accede to the demands, which I think are very reasonable. But now there is a report in the Financial Times saying that she's offered to resign several times. Well, I think if she goes, it would be good. Then we just get a new person to come in. And otherwise, if she keeps hiding in Government House, it's not going to help. The situation will get worse. Okay,
Lawrence Ma, to you, do you see the resignation of Carrie Lam as helping to bring this to a close, or where do you see this ending?
No, it won't come to an end because of her resignation. Because this is a good time and good opportunity for people to remind you. There's an election in November this year, and there is a more important election next year. And people and oppositions want to keep up that sentiment and that opposition sentiment so that they can get better votes. If people are more scared about China, about the government, they would vote for the opposition. And that's what they want to prolong. They want to drag on. They want to keep the sentiment of the protest so that they can get more votes and win an election in November and then in next year in September. July.
Emily Lau, do you think that's the case, that this is all just political posturing ahead of an election?
Well, of course there's an election coming up, and we would like to see pro-democracy candidates winning. But I think many of us do not want to see the violence in the streets. If you have big, peaceful protests, that's great. But we don't want to see the protesters beating up the policemen beating up the protesters and all this standoff. I think many of us do not want to see that. So Lawrence is completely wrong.
Okay, and James Palmer, I'm going to give you the last words here quickly, if you could. How do you see this ending?
I think that while these protests may die down, Hong Kong is going to be a very unhappy, very disturbed place over the course of the next few years or decades. And until something politically changes on the mainland that allows for more liberalization, Hong Kongers are going to keep drifting away from the mainland, and we're going to see very fierce protests and, in turn, increased repression by the authorities.
Okay, and with that, we'll have to draw our discussion to a close. I'd like to thank all three of my guests, Emily Lau, James Palmer and Lawrence Ma. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And the conversation continues online. Just head to our Facebook page at /AJ Inside Story to take part, or you can join the discussion on Twitter. We're at AJ Inside Story, or tweet me directly at Hala Mahideen. But for me and the whole team, it's bye for now.